What's up, Scyushi Squad? We are back in the Trove, and today we're going to continue the tradition of the 36K series, but we are going to be introducing the Solarion, the newest class that's been added to the game. Those of you on console should be getting this update and more. Summer 2022 is what they say, so we'll just hope that you guys are going to get in July, fingers crossed. Before we get started with today's video, this is a new class. You know, obviously we're going to end up having other videos that are going to focus on its abilities. Today's video is strictly trying to focus on how this character is going to end up operating at 36 kpr. So to stay consistent with the series, we're going to end up taking it into U10 geode surface, because that before this update was the strongest area in the game for open world, and then we're going to end up going into the delves. Now I want you guys to keep in mind that I still have to record 36k power rank videos for all the other physical classes in the game, and after I'm done with those projects, at that point I'll start upgrading my gems to crystal, because I figure that this is a series that still warrants being done. You know, we could technically just jump up to over 40 kpr right now, but I feel like that is very, very much pushing the line between what is accomplishable or achievable for the average player. Now, obviously, you know, I'm really, really powerful and have like almost completely maxed out gear. Game crashed, but I'm just trying to say that while we do have Uber 11 difficulty and so on and so forth, we'll save that for the next step of videos. Okay, we'll end up having those videos be covered this year for sure. It's also going to end up taking me quite a while to get my gems maxed out and fully crystallized and everything like that, just because it's just such a tedious process. And so that's why I want to end up getting the 36k videos ready. Now, another thing too I gotta mention, as you notice, we crashed. This update is crashing like crazy, man. Like, is it just me? I've had it crash the most. The most Trove has crashed in a very, very long time. Let's start the timer here. We're going to be doing a 5-minute timer on geode surface, and I'm going to kind of walk you guys through how the class is going to end up faring in terms of it versus other classes at a similar power rank, but then also little brief stints of how you're going to end up playing the class, and then just generally speaking, you know, just kind of a rule of thumb of, okay, well, here's what you're watching out for. So you'll notice that I don't really end up using most of my abilities outside of your number 1 ability, and most of all that's because the Solarion plays very, very similar to the Shadow Hunter. Obviously, being a bow character means that it does use physical damage and so on and so forth, and we'll end up having a proper build video for the Solarion at some point. But the number 1 ability, similar to the Shadow Hunter's Trap, is actually a very big area of effect ability that is going to end up damaging a whole bunch of nearby enemies. I don't know how this guy was able to join me. Usually I try to give you guys good examples of showing off how powerful a class can be when I'm alone, and I am appearing offline and everything, but it's just, I don't know. Anyways, you can see the absolute devastation of this class. You know, this guy is going to, he'll be perfectly fine as far as U10 is concerned. This game is unplayable. You thought that the other 36k videos made me frustrated with all the rubber banding and stuff? Look at this. This is what it's been like ever since this update came out, dude. But you can see our basic shots, you know, they're doing a pretty decent amount of damage on top of all of our other abilities. If we ever ended up fighting an opponent that required us to use more of our abilities, the way the Solarion works is he's got damage over time, or as you've probably heard many other players, including myself, refer to as DOT. So that's what it literally means. It's just damage over time. It's just RPG terminology, right? But basically, if we end up tagging an enemy with our number 1 ability, it applies a dot. If we tag an enemy with our right click, it applies a dot, so on and so forth, right? As we're damaging enemies, we're also building up energy, and then you'll see this really weird, ugly thing in the bottom middle of our screen. That is actually how many projectiles we are shooting out of our bow right now. Dear God, that's how many projectiles we're shooting out of our bow right now, is based on the amount of feathers that are in the bottom middle of our screen. And you kind of end up building that up with using your other abilities and so on and so forth. Anyways, let's talk about the class itself and what I think of where it ends up fitting in the game. Do I think that it's going to end up being a top tier damage class character? It kind of remains to be seen. There has been some changes from the Solarion that was on the test server versus the one that we currently have on the live server. Generally speaking, I feel like the Solarion is... he's pretty similar to what I had said before, where it's kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. For those that are on the fence of whether or not you want to end up getting the class or whether or not you think it's actually worth maining, let me just put it into perspective for you. Since this class uses Shadowhunter gear, I'm assuming that the average player that's getting this guy probably already has a pretty beefed out Shadowhunter and can very easily end up swapping all of your gear to this guy, right? You don't have to do that if you don't want to, because the Shadowhunter is just flat out better. The Solarion is not useless, though. I want to really push that, because a lot of people are giving this class a lot of slack, saying, oh, you know, what's the point in using it and stuff like that. You know, the lag that we're dealing with right now is obviously something that you can't really account for. But the problem kind of falters with the class and its abilities themselves. So the right-click ability, you have to wait for the entire animation to finish. You want to know why? Because it's a recycled right-click from the Shadowhunter. You remember that ability that nobody liked, that they eventually ended up removing, thank God, in the Shadowhunter rework? Those of you on console obviously don't know about that yet, but pretty much all the abilities on Shadowhunter got changed, and it seems like they ended up recycling the right-click attack of the Shadowhunter into the Solarion. But the biggest problem is that when you're doing, you know, dungeon farming, usually what comes into play is speed farming. So the two factors that are going to end up being the mains for that is how fast can you travel from one dungeon to another, and how fast can you end up killing things. Those are the two main factors to determine whether a class is going to end up being viable for speed farming. And as you can see, unfortunately, the Solarion doesn't seem to have anything in terms of its movement speed capabilities, and so travel distance from one dungeon to another is kind of null. It's just not really there. I'm not even going to the left, good God. But the damage output is definitely fine. You know, like we're able to clear dungeons really quickly. And again, if I ever needed to use all of my abilities, especially my ultimate ability, it would just devastate all of the enemies that are in these biomes and dungeons and stuff like that. However, one thing that I do gotta mention in this video, and I will probably end up mentioning in the other 36K videos, is that now that we have U11 difficulty, unfortunately, a lot of these factors, you know, with a class, like right now, I would say, oh, Solarion's great. You can main it because it handles U10 no problem. It handles delves no problem. However, with U11 being such an insane difficulty spike, we're kind of in the same boat that we were with Trove years ago, before we ended up having the reworks and stuff like that to the classes, where certain classes will just flat out falter and be worse than others because the way that U11 just ends up scaling. Now, that said, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to thoroughly enjoy the Solarion, because I feel similar to the Bard that this class fills out a specific role that the game doesn't have for other classes, which is going to end up being the whole damage over time thing. You know, I've talked about this before as well, where lots of players, you know, diss the Bard and don't really like it. But then there's the people that do enjoy the class. They love it. It's their favorite class in the game. And I feel like the Solarion is going to end up being kind of the same thing, where for me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of dot effects on a class. I guess poison builds can end up being pretty good, but the fact that we're basically just tagging enemies and then hoping that, you know, having it damage slowly over time means that we don't really get to see the true potential of this class unless we start fighting a super duper strong opponent. So again, you can see delves no problem. This class is a beast, okay? You are going to be absolutely fine with damaging most of the enemies in the game, and most of the things that the game is going to end up throwing at you, it is going to be okay. I just wanted to end up mentioning the U11 thing for the sake of discrepancy, you know, just so that you guys know that the class does kind of fall off when it ends up coming to the big boy end game Chongo damage, at least in terms of U11, just because of how much the enemies end up scaling. But as you can see with this delve, I mean, granted, it's not a super duper deep delve. You know, being at def 119 is basically going to end up making it the equivalent of doing U10 anyways, but no problem. I mean, obviously, you know, the delves are very random with how they end up generating and stuff like that, but I personally think that this class, with its #1 ability and the ability to do basically a shotgun blast with your arrows, I think that the class can handle a group of enemies very well. How you end up doing big Chongo damage with this class is you basically want to end up having all of your dots on a boss or on an enemy at once, and then you're going to end up using your base attack to actually refresh those dots. So normally you end up tagging an enemy and then the dot ends up lasting a certain amount of time before it goes away. But if you keep tagging the enemy with your base attack, it's going to constantly refresh that. So even though I absolutely hate the right click attack, we would probably want to open with that, drop down a bunch of number ones, use a flask, use our ult, and then just start doing insane amounts of damage. As you can see, like, this class, if anything, it's a boss killer. Okay. And again, I know that there's going to end up being people that are going to say like, oh no, it's not that great, it's not better than Chloromancer or Shadowhunter and stuff, but that's not what these videos are about. These videos are about showing you guys the potential of this class, because it might be a class that you want to main. And I can just tell you straight up that the Solarion is a powerhouse. It's not going to end up being the top per se in any specific category, but it's definitely up there, and as you can see, is devastating when you get all of your damage over time effects on a more powerful enemy that can actually sustain a little bit of damage. Because with normal enemies, no problem, we can just destroy them immediately. But as soon as you end up having an opponent that you can use all of your ults on, or all of your abilities and your ult and stuff like that, the burst damage is really, really good. Now, I haven't necessarily tried the Solarion versus a Leviathan. I do feel confident that it's a class that I would probably be able to two-man a U10 Leviathan with. I don't know if I would end up having the damage output, or more so the survivability of being able to solo it. Because that's another really important factor that I didn't get into, is with the delves, rather than speed, you're actually focused on either dealing so much damage that you take less damage because everything you're fighting is dead right away, which is where the Solarion fits into as far as its category, or you need to have survivability so that you can take all of the hits because maybe you deal a little bit less damage as another class, but you need to stay alive longer to compensate for it. So obviously, you know, I'm using the Vampirium gem, so that ends up giving me a lot more survivability than if I was using Berserker or anything like that. But let that be, you know, an example of the fact that we didn't even need to end up using Berserk and end up getting the extra light value that you get from that in order to end up absolutely mopping the floor with these enemies. So my review, I think that the class is fantastic. It is a lot of fun, but for me personally, as I mentioned, I'm not a fan of the damage over time effect. That doesn't mean that this isn't going to be somebody's absolute favorite class, and I think that if you're waiting for this, if you can't wait for this class, you're going to be very, very pleasantly surprised with it. The only thing, as I mentioned, that I hate about this class is the right-click ability, and I was actually very vocal about that in letting the devs know about it. Or more so, I tweeted about it, and then they said, oh, we'll let the devs know about it or anything. People seem to think that I have contact with them directly, but I don't. But it seems like they didn't end up changing anything. I'm honestly fine with the right click. I'm not fine with the fact that it works the same as the old Shadowhunter, where, watch what I'm going to do. So I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to hold left click immediately. See? Literally copy and paste from the Shadowhunter. So for those of you that don't know what the heck I'm even talking about right now, it's the fact that when I right click and start holding my attack, I have to wait for the animation to finish before I can start outputting damage again, which was the problem with the right click ability on the Shadowhunter as well. I really, really hope that the devs consider at some point to make it an instacast, or at the very least something that I could cast and then go right back into dealing damage and doing my primary attack. Now that said, see, even with spamming my number 1 ability, watch, I'll do the same thing. Right click, and there you go. That's how long you have to wait, which makes it the ability that you want to use as an opener on a boss. And then otherwise for normal world enemies and stuff like that, I just never find that I'm using it, because why would I use that when I can just end up popping out one of the other abilities with a much shorter animation window? Anyways, thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed. Smash like, sub for more. Buy the merch you want to support the channel.